Award. Woo. Right now, she manages an interdisciplinary team of social scientists, human factor engineers, and designers, and she's conducted fieldwork around the world. She believes that we can find out a lot about cultural differences by studying how people use technology, and she's currently working on a book based on this, specifically with her ethnographic research in Asia. Please help me welcome Genevieve Bell.
Thank you. All right, it's lovely to be here and slightly intimidating because I can't actually see any of you, so I'm going to assume there are people out there and that you will laugh at all the jokes as you should. I feel the need to begin all of my talks with the usual set of apologies. Although my name is Genevieve, I'm in fact not European, I'm Australian, which means I could swear in the next 30 minutes, so I'm sorry about that. But Libby, wherever you are, the answer is you should call your mother. I know there's at least one other Australian in the audience. Also, it's sort of, I think, difficult to imagine that there may be an anthropologist at Intel. There is not, in fact, one at this point. There's nearly 30 of us. And our job has been to help orient Intel to the notion that what people do with their technology and what they care about in a larger sense is where we should start innovating towards the future. I wanted to give a slightly different talk today than the one you just heard, though ironically I find myself starting with a photo from Young Hee's birthplace. The photo here is from Busan in Korea. Each one of those is a little baby Buddha. It's about this size. It's left at this particular temple by people who come to visit here, and each one of these little Buddhas represents a secret. You make a wish or a prayer, and you leave the Buddha there to manifest and symbolize it. And I want us to keep that in mind as I go through the rest of this presentation. Late last year, I locked myself out of my Flickr account. You may wonder what that has to do with anything at this conference, but I found myself having lied to Flickr about my birth date, as I had lied to Yahoo about my birth date, because I figured they didn't need to know how old I was. I'd also lied about my place of birth, but I turned out not to be consistent about this. So I had no idea what lie I had told. Had I said I was 10 or 100? And as I couldn't work this out for quite some time, I was unable to use all manner of my various online services. And it got me to thinking about the ways we choose to protect our identity and the mechanisms that we use to do that. And in the process of that, I found myself looking around the globe and thinking, I wonder who else is as foolish as I am. And a series of data points caught my eye, and I wanted to sort of reflect upon them here. The first was that there was a survey conducted in Britain in 2006 that suggested that nearly half of people in Britain using their mobile phones actively lie about where they are in text messages. So those texts that say, "Hi honey, I'm on the way home," turn out not to be true for the most part. The second was that my dear friend at Cornell University, Jeff Hancock, has just finished doing some work on online dating and found that 100% of people using online dating sites lie about themselves. Men, it turns out, lie about their height, women lie about their weight. It's perhaps no great surprise in either of those things. What was more surprising was that no self-presentation was quote-unquote accurate. James Katz, another academic in the United States at Rutgers University who's written a lot in the mobile space, was reflecting on all of this and said that he thought we were entering what he termed an arms race of digital deception. And that for every device that claimed and purport to tell the truth, like GPS, like the various sites where we can announce where we are and what we're doing, there was another service that was created to allow us purposefully to deceive. Whether those were alibi services, whether those were the mechanisms that we encountered in British youth 3 and 4 years ago who, when their parents said, "I'm giving you this camera phone and I expect you to take a picture of yourself when you've gotten wherever you're going so I know where you are," we discovered kids had an entire bank of photos of themselves where they quote-unquote should be. And their parents got to the point of saying, "And we'll need a copy of today's newspaper," in that picture with the headline, which starts to sound suspiciously like ransom notes. So I got to thinking, if I'm locking myself out of Flickr because I'm lying to Yahoo, and if the English can't tell the truth about where they are, and if the Americans are all fatter and older than they really should be, where does that get us? And what might that tell us about the online state of affairs? And what would an ethnographic lens looking back at those things generate for us? Because I think in some ways these are the statistics that make the little happy section in our various local papers and are held up as the foibles of humanity. But I think there's something more going on here, and for me the question is, what does an anthropological gaze on those things yield? And I want to be clear here, unlike the previous presentation, this is not somewhere where we've done extensive fieldwork. This is me taking the tools of my trade, the theoretical tools of anthropology, which I expect Paul will reflect on later, and applying them to a particular set of problems. Now, by the same token, it's done against the backdrop, for me at this point, of 10 years' worth of research and of my own teams of the last 2 years. It's intensely global, it's comparative, and it comes out of a perspective, which I think is a very anthropological one, that technology changes faster than people do. It's really easy to be swept up in a sense that technology has transformed all of us, but in many ways the things people care about and the things people practice in their daily lives transform far more slowly than the technology would believe. And maybe that's a hard thing to talk to a conference of people who share my same preoccupations. It's certainly something that it's very hard for Intel to wrap its head around. But what I want to suggest here is that the things people are doing in some ways haven't changed over a very long period of time, and these new technologies find themselves caught in the middle of all of that. So if you want to talk about this notion of digital deception, I want to take a step back from that and think about how do we talk about it as anthropologists. For me, it means thinking about two things, not deception, but about secrets and lies. I want to parse the difference there between those two things. Lies being the notion of untruths, and secrets being the knowledge that we withhold out of the public discourse for all manner of different reasons. And I want to think about what the cultural ideals are that are wrapped up in this. So how is it that we hold up these things? And for the most part, as evidenced by your earlier laughing, we know that lying is inherently, for the most part, a bad thing. It's certainly enshrined in many legal systems around the world as being something one doesn't do. One does not lie when one takes the stand, except under certain circumstances. Most of the major religions, or the axial religions, have fairly clear prescriptions and rules about lying. For those of you who were raised Catholic, we know that there is the notion of sins of omission and sins of commission. The act of lying or the act of withholding information having two very different, basically, standings as to how bad you have been and what your retribution will be here. It also turns out across all of the other major religions, there are categories where there are certain moments when not completely telling the truth is okay. In Islam, for instance, Muhammad himself writes about the fact that whilst the truth will pretty much always have out, there are circumstances in which it's okay not to tell the full truth. He particularly calls attention to bringing peace and resolution between families and households, but also within a household, and says pretty much, and I quote, almost extant, that should your wife ask you if you think she is still lovely, it is appropriate to answer yes, even if you don't believe that to be true. Similar prescriptions in Judaism and in the law there and in various interpretations of it that suggest again that it's okay to withhold certain sorts of information when negotiating peace between nations, peace between households, and peace within households. If you look into Hinduism and other sort of religious traditions, you find similar kinds of notions about when it's okay not to engage in truthful acts. One of my colleagues told me recently that in Tamil the expression is basically, it's okay to tell 1,000 lies if the wedding still happens. So again, here a notion that in certain circumstances, certain reframings of the quote-unquote truth are okay if the appropriate end is accomplished. So we have notions, I think, in English we would talk about white lies or good lies. Secrets are a completely different matter under multiple cultural prescriptions around the globe. There's notions about keeping secrets as being good. It's certainly one of the ways we create relationships of reciprocity. We did it when we were little kids. How do you make friends with someone? You tell them something that you hope they will tell no one else. We know that keeping those secrets is a way of maintaining those relationships and of demonstrating trust. It's also fairly hard not to be a citizen of the globe and know that keeping secrets has, at this point, various complicated notions at law, particularly in terms of national security. It's hard not to think about how certain sorts of information are now being crafted as secret and under what circumstances they can be shared and how. But if those are the cultural ideals, there's a set of cultural practices that operate too. And here I want to distinguish between the notion of what we say we do and what we actually do. And for many things, there's often a gap between those two things, between the cultural ideals and the everyday practice. And here, depending on who you listen to and what you read, we're telling lies all the time. According to psychologists who study in both Europe and the United States and Australia, we're talking at somewhere between 6 to 200 lies a day. Now, granted, these are everything from the conventional lies, I would say, of greasing the social skids, of the usual, how are you? I'm fine, when what you're thinking is I'm jet-lagged, I'm hungover, I'm miserable, but it would be rude to say any of those things, so what I will say is I'm fine, to the lies that are much more complicated and much more intense. And according to the people who track this kind of thing, at the point that you're telling 200 lies a day, you border on the pathological. Perhaps not surprisingly. It's also a lot of conversation to be having, frankly. Motivations for those lies really run the gamut, again, coming out of the psychological literature here. It's about concealing misbehaviour, also about just continuing to keep one's social world ticking over. And less than 10% of lies are inherently about increasing one's popularity. So those lies about weight and height turn out to be about something quite different. According, again, to the same body of quite extensive literature, men tell more lies than women. This same body of literature would tell you that women tell fewer but better lies and are more convincing at it. Men, not surprisingly, lie about all the things one would expect in the Western tradition: what kind of cars they drive, what sort of jobs they have, what they do in their spare time, and their marital status. Women lie about their weight, their age, their marital status, and what they bought when they last went shopping. This suggests to me this particular body of literature is particularly scoped here. I think this does not globalise to the world, but it does tell you that the notion that telling lies is bad is hardly carried out in our daily practice. Secrets, it turns out, are even more complicated. And perhaps that's not surprising, given that we have such an ambiguous relation to them as cultural ideals. How we deal with them as cultural practice is also not so surprising. I think you can argue, when you think about both your own lives and the lives of those around you, that secrets are kept and broken, irrespective of their status at law under various Patriots Acts or within religion. There are also a series of other perspectives you could take here that I think are worth bringing into a conversation around what digital deception might be and why it's interesting. Social theorists who would argue that lying is a necessary part of daily life. A series of European thinkers here who are particularly important. Peter Steignitz, who says that the lie is not actually about the opposite of truth, it's in fact about a conscious prevention of certain sorts of reality. So that lying is in fact about negating the real around one, not about negating truth. I think it's an interesting reconceptualization of it, particularly as we think about what may or may not be going on in digital spheres. Volker Sommer talks about the fact that self-deception is a necessary part of human survival, and that in fact being able to actively repress what's going on around you is one of the only ways we get through the day. While that may be a faintly dismal interpretation, it does again suggest something quite different about what might be going on online. That our deceptiveness, quote unquote, may not be about dissembling the truth, but about other ways of playfulness and engaging. And indeed, the anthropologists of childhood development, along with psychologists of childhood development, would tell you that the ways in which children play with their identities, how old are you? I'm 3 when you know that they're 5, or I'm 5 when you know that they're 3, is in fact a way that kids work through what's appropriate and inappropriate in terms of speech, acts and behaviours. And whilst I wouldn't want to argue that as adults we're doing the same things online, me telling Yahoo I'm 40 or 110 is probably not me playing with my identity, but there are certainly ways of constituting this as a playful act and working through what the rules are here. There's another way you can conceptualize secrets too, and this again comes out of, for the most part, the anthropological literature. And this is a twofold thing. One is to say that the notion that all information should be equally available to everyone is in fact a relatively recent concept, and not one that has a great deal of standing in cultures all over the world. And as a social scientist, it's always one that I find interesting when I encounter the rhetoric around the internet that all information should be available equally, because you find various communities and cultures wanting to hold information back. So for those of you online, if you go to the Australian Institute for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, I'm not going to repeat that, you'll find that their website has a really interesting set of splash pages and cautions and warnings that warn you that the content that you're about to see may be disturbing, offensive or troubling if you're an Aboriginal person from particular spaces. So they understand that while the information needs to be made available, it needs to be made available through a series of gates and warnings. And part of what's going on there is a set of things that have long-standing tradition in Australian anthropology around the notion of the secret and the sacred. So that not all knowledge should be in the public domain and that not all knowledge should be available to everyone equally. This image here is taken from a piece of art I own from a community I grew up in. And if you were to look at it from the audience, you can say, well, you know, it's an interesting piece of Aboriginal dot art. Maybe it's from Central Australia. Because I grew up there and because I know part of what's going on, I can also tell you that's a map of a piece of country. I could choose to reveal to you what piece of country that is, what the significant features are in that piece of country, and why that painting is not just a map but a representation of social relationships. So part of what's happening there is that what appears to be in the public domain is in fact already coded 3 to 4 steps back from what you're seeing, and you have to have a particular set of knowledge in some ways to make sense of the thing that you're looking at. And again, I would argue that kind of playfulness and practice is also happening in the digital sphere. The way we choose to present ourselves, the kind of manifestations we make, whether it's in the cell phone numbers we give ourselves, the personas that we adopt online, our various avatars, can be read in multiple different ways. And depending on the knowledge of the looker, as well as the thing being looked at, you can start to see very different senses of what's going on there. You can also imagine in this particular framework in Aboriginal Australia that withholding information is a way of keeping it safe. So that if you don't put it out in the public domain, no one can know it if no one knows that the information is quote-unquote safe. And here again, the parallels to the digital world are really interesting. What we choose to withhold and why is also about a mechanism of keeping ourselves safe. So if you imagine this framework here, with cultural ideals on the one hand that say lying bad, secrets ambiguous and difficult, cultural practice on the other that says, well, actually, we lie from the moment we get up in the morning to the moment we go down to bed at night, and most of you in the room have already told 1 or 2 lies in the day. Congratulations. To this notion that what is that really about? Is it that we're abrogating truth, or is it that we're choosing to shape our own realities in really different ways? Where does all of that lead us as we circle back to new technologies? Well, part of it is to say that new information and communication technologies manifested themselves inside this already incredibly complicated space, where there are already tensions between the cultural ideals and the cultural practice, and where these played out very differently in different parts of the world. And as a result, you see different kinds of tracts around the globe as to how these things get sorted out or don't. It's certainly the case as we look across everything from devices to infrastructures to websites and the applications that sit on them, that lying about where you are, what you're doing, who you are, everything from how fat you are or aren't, to what it is you want to be when you grow up, to your demographic, your marital status, it's a big thing, and your social standing, are all things about which we dissemble online, and we're not the only ones. Most of the web population is doing the same. And in fact, I think you can sometimes argue that some of that dissembling is in fact required. One of my colleagues, Dana Boyd, points out that the population she's been studying of MySpace users, because of American law that says you have to be over the age of 14 to participate, choose to lie about their age. And she says if you actually track the age of people participating on MySpace, there is a stunning number of people who are over the age of 100. And whilst I would like to believe that that was genuinely true, I think that 10% of the population of MySpace being over the age of 100 kind of begs credibility and may in fact be about something else. So there the price of participation is a lie. In order to get around COPA and American laws, you already actively have to dissemble about who you are. And the motives for doing this, in addition to getting around legal ramifications, may be all kinds of things. I think it's not a long stretch to argue that some of these lies and secrets are about ways of protecting private information. It's clearly why I don't tell Yahoo my birth date. It's not out of vanity. It's out of the fact that I think it's none of their business, and I turn out not to be the only one. I think part of it's about identity play. These images here come from an article recently about Second Life in the New York Times. The picture above shows an individual, the picture below shows his avatar. I would argue there's not an obvious relationship between these two things. And clearly there's a kind of playfulness here about not only physical appearance, but quite possibly aspiration and status and standing too. And there's all kinds of things that are happening there that make that image interesting. I also have to wonder, however, given some of the more recent work being done both in the United States and Israel by sociologists and psychologists studying this, whether there are other things going on here. A recent study of online participants, again on online dating sites. Turns out if you want to be surveyed, an online dating site is a great place to be hanging out, to be found by social scientists. Israeli researchers discovered that, in fact, unlike the acts of lying and secret keeping in the physical world, where we do, in fact, for most of the religious reasons I outlined earlier, experience feelings of guilt and shame and a mild sense of worry, our online lying manifests none of those feelings. In fact, it's frequently characterized by almost glee, and that there's something we get out of that act of dissembling that looks nothing like the lies, quote unquote, that we tell in the real world, whatever that would really be. So I happened to keep asking myself about whether some of the sites that we participate in, everything I would argue from social networking to others, are in fact flourishing in part because they appeal to this very desire to not entirely tell the truth, or perhaps to deny the realities that were existing, and would be a better way of framing it. And that's certainly the case when you talk about secrets. The number of sites out there dedicated to keeping secrets in one way or another are absolutely fascinating. This image is drawn from postsecretblogspot.com, which, if you haven't been, is a truly remarkable site where people send in postcards with their secrets written on them anonymously, and the postcards are posted online. The secrets are like this one here, written on a Rockwell image that my prom date was gay and I pretended not to know. Is an interesting secret, more interesting that one would choose to share it. And indeed, most of this website is dedicated to secrets of the kind that one wonders why they are both kept and why they're shared in this manner. But there's a series of websites dedicated to this, and I think it's not such a stretch, as some of my colleagues in Australia are already doing, to suggest that sites like Twitter are actually about making an art out of a form of confabulation. That one simply can't spend that much time worrying about making coffee and cleaning one's bathtub. And then, in fact, what is going on there is, a re-emergence of the social lying of the 18th and 19th centuries. Returning back to cats for a minute here too, one might want to think about the ways in which the uncovering and celebrating of deception is also going on, both online and in the device world that kind of constellates around it. Cell phones clearly have tracking services attendant to them. When I did fieldwork in Korea 3 years ago and 4 years ago, the kids I was hanging out with, all of their parents subscribed to cell phone tracking services and their cell phones were being tracked. When I asked them how they felt about that and whether this was true about their peers as well, the answer was always, I feel really sorry for my peers whose parents don't track them because I know my parents love me more. It was such an inversion of the language that one imagines about those things in the United States that it was fascinating to think about how surveillance and tracking and notions of where one is can get sort of culturally reconfigured and reconfigured again. People like the researchers at Cornell have worked out how to run lie detection algorithms on text messaging and email. It has to do with whether one chooses to use more words or not. Apparently, the bigger the lie, the more words you use. So I share that as a tip. And there are certainly alibi services out there, both primarily in the United States and Japan, that will create entire backstories for you. So had you told your significant other you were coming to lift but you weren't here, they would have managed to produce a program for you, receipts from the various events you might have gone to, even some pictures to suggest you had been here. And depending on how elaborate the backstory you want, priced accordingly. It could just be as simple as noise and photos on your cell phone to these fully elaborate packages. And I think this is where Cats is really sort of riffing on the notion of an arms race. But for me, I want to come back again to what it is we start to make of these things and to why it is that focusing on secrets and lies rather than digital deception is, for me, an interesting research tool. I think it's two things in particular. One is that this tension between the cultural ideal and the cultural practice, I think, turns out to be really significant. And that part of what's going on in the internet space in particular as we're playing through these things is sorting out the tensions between the cultural ideals and the cultural practices. And a new generation of technology that in some ways can't help but tell the truth is about to arrive in the middle of all of this. Tracking services, anything that announces where one is, some of the new multi-sided games, some of the new sensor technology, all suggests that it can start to tell you where it is, or tell others where you are. And part of what seems to be going on is a great deal of human concern about whether you'd like your device to announce unbidden where you were, and how you might stop that from happening. I also think that thinking about secrets and lies for me and for Intel was a really useful way of reworking the notions of privacy and security. Systems and networks, infrastructures worry about privacy and security, but for the most part, when you really push people, what they're concerned about is the things that they don't want to have told. And when you talk to people about what it is they're doing, it's about the things they want to keep secret and the things that they don't think they want to have in the public domain. And part of their strategy for getting around that is around telling lies. And this is not about the conventional understandings of privacy and security, but if we use those as a starting point, we might imagine very different systems that we develop as a result of that. And I then have to wonder where that leads us. If the Israeli researchers are right and we like lying online, where do we start to imagine that takes us in building social networking sites? Where does that take us in the much vaunted but not yet arrived Web 3.0? And what does that look like if it's based on a bedrock of confabulation? And then also for me, as I think about moving between multiple Western countries deeply concerned about notions of national security, among other things, And as I think about crossing back into the US again with my foreign passport, I wonder about how this language of secrets and lies fits into that larger set of conversations about national security and about safety and danger. And I wanted to leave it there and say thank you. Actually, I lied, because I have to point out this photo first, which is, of course, the other thing, is that you can tell secrets and lies all you like, and you can trust your satellite navigation devices. But apparently, in Britain, satellite navigation devices also lie. And this is a sign from a small town in Britain where the road is not a 2-lane highway, as your satellite navigation device suggests, but a 6-foot wide road. So, of course, the other tension here is whether you can trust your devices when they tell you that you're safe. Done.